I think it is really important for us to consider the fact that these protests that are continuing to be strong throughout the country are predominantly focused on kind of trying to identify and root out anti-Black racism within these U.S. structures. And at the same time, we're seeing that Black and Latino Americans are 3 times higher than white Americans to be contracting COVID, and that their mortality rates are much higher, right? So we don't need to look at those as separate from one another. COVID is laying bare the racial disparities that people are protesting against. And I think this pandemic and people of color seeing that it was themselves and their loved ones that had to continue working because they're in essential jobs and service work there. So that makes them disproportionately likely to contract the disease. Seeing that the lower quality access to healthcare has even more pronounced impacts. Seeing that they live in food deserts, so they don't have as easy access to food. And so it's not as easy as, I can just have, Whole Foods delivered to my door. That's not an option for me. I still have to make this 25-minute commute to this grocery store. And because it's the one grocery store for all of us, we're still going to be packed in that store, right? People seeing all the ways in which their everyday vulnerabilities, which might be more tethered to class than race, but are still present, how COVID made those all the more kind of risky and all the more potentially fatal. So I think that probably motivated a number of people to actually participate in these protests because they're in a moment in which they can't be distracted from, right, or can't deny the continued impact of these disparities on their day-to-day lives. Maybe in January, not as many people might have been motivated to take to the streets, but when this happens in March and April, and it's we've been sitting for 3 months with the weight of these disparities, yeah, I'm willing to take to the streets. So I think that is really something that's important for us to consider, not just how the protests haven't raised COVID rates, but how COVID might be a significant, spark that helps to light this fire.
So speaking about protests, we've seen police brutality cases that have led to these protests, especially in the case of 2014 in Ferguson. George Floyd's death, how did it go from a nationwide protest to a global one?
So I wonder about what this moment that we're in as a world also does in contributing, right, to kind of creating these kinds of transnational senses of solidarity. It's kind of seeing people grapple with what this COVID pandemic has meant to our world. And one of the things that struck me from people that were trying to grapple with it was a sense that, for all of the struggles, there's something uniquely and profoundly uniting in that all around the world, we basically have to stay home, right? And kind of all around the world, regardless of time zone and language and customs, we're being encouraged to follow the same set of altered social practices. And I don't know what the medical physical bonds are, right, that can develop from that. But it does seem that just as George Floyd's death struck a particular chord with people in the midst of kind of staying at home and not having the typical distractions, it seems like that really was a similar situation throughout the world, right? Whereas you were speaking, right, you can see what's happening and connect it to the Aboriginal and Indigenous populations in Australia, right? Other people, everyone in the world has a population where they can say, if they're being honest, right, this group has borne the brunt of our society's unbalanced or antiquated laws and policies and practices. And if it takes this moment to make each of these groups visible in a way that we can't systematically or collectively deny their experiences and deny the fact that they've been denied a fair shot, then, maybe we will see something that's genuinely momentous and substantive from this moment.
So Corona, or should I say COVID-19, was a blessing in disguise almost for the movement.
Well,
in a very weird way.
For the movement, yeah. I think it has propelled the movement, right? I'll never call it a blessing, but I will say I think it is actually instrumental, right? One thing I try to do in my classes is think through, all right, we look at this moment in history, for instance, the civil rights movement, or the kind of era of 60s and 70s protests in the US. Why did this happen? Seriously, why? What was present in these years that wasn't present in other years, right? And so definitely, when we look at this time, We have these things that are present now that simply haven't been present before. So it has to matter, right? Like we look at the counterfactual. These factors weren't there and we haven't seen this global action. And we have counterfactuals, right? George Floyd is killed in Minneapolis or Minnesota, sparking protests, sparking Minneapolis as an epicenter for protests. In 2016, Philando Castile is killed in Minneapolis, sparking protests. So very similar situations, same city. And what's the difference, right? So in the US context, the difference is in the Trump era versus the Obama era, and COVID versus not, no generation defining global pandemic that's disproportionately affecting people. These factors have to be mattering and why we're seeing this type of movement continue to kind of amplify when past movements from just 4 years ago didn't have the same reach.
When we talk about Philando Castile, he was a black man that was legally owning a firearm, and in terms of his background, he wasn't like a criminal or anything. But with George Floyd, there seems to be a focus on he had a criminal background or he was possibly using a forged check. Why is there always a focus on the criminality of him? When I think about it, even if he was using forged checks or something like that, it's not a crime that would ever result being choked to death or injury, really.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it connects to the earlier thread we were having about the kind of continued way in which Black and brown people can be linked to criminality, right? So even when you don't pose a threat, the association is so strong in the minds of people that want to make sense of this. And I want to also take a step back to say, people look at that footage and say, this doesn't make sense. Why would you literally squeeze the life out of this man? You hear him protesting, saying he can't breathe for minutes, and you just let those minutes pass by agonizingly so. Each one more breath coming out of his body until he has no more breaths to give. And people see that and they say, I don't know what country this is when that happens, when a police officer does that. And so they have to rationalize it. They have to justify it. There has to be something missing. So maybe he posed some kind of threat that wasn't represented in the video, but I don't know, is he some kind of criminal or something, right? So I think that is kind of reverse engineering a justification, because it's really hard for a lot of people to sit with the idea that this is America. And many Black people in communities across the US are sitting there saying, not only is this America, this has always been America. So I think that's part of the motivation for us to always kind of look to the criminal records, not just the kind of long running stereotype, but like, if it really is as simple as this person posed no threat, then I have to kind of interrogate everything I know about this country, or at least everything I know about the police, everything I know about race in this country. And for a lot of people, they don't want to do that. So it's easier to say, well, he must have been some kind of threat somehow. We saw Trayvon Martin, right? Like Trayvon Martin's a 17-year-old kid that's walking back home after grabbing some Skittles from a convenience store. And people said, well, he looked threatening in a hoodie. Like a hoodie, seriously. Like what kid doesn't wear a hoodie, right? Like, and so we can think about the racial fraughtness of that, because I know that every kid that I went to school with had a hoodie, right? But apparently it's only the Black kids that wear those hoodies that are dangerous. And then people said, oh, well, he smoked weed before, so could he have been some kind of threat? And again, I go back to those rates of marijuana use. They're equivalent. In fact, for people under the age of 18, white people smoke marijuana at a slightly higher rate than Black people. And on top of that, when I look at any kind of coming of age film or TV show, it's Freaks and Geeks or whatever you want to input there, like there's always some like, oh, it's time for the kids to experiment with drug use, right? Like it's seen as a rite of passage for this group, and for this group, it's seen as a marker of death. To think about the $20, the counterfeit money, I saw a white man say, this is white privilege in a nutshell. I was arrested a couple years back for allegedly using a forged $20 bill to pay for something. And it's the story that I tell at dinner parties. George Floyd was arrested for the same, and he'll never come home to his family again. And so we have to always reckon with, right, grapple with that contradiction. Because if you don't grapple with that contradiction and you lean on, oh, well, somewhere down the line, he did something 12 years ago that makes this justified, right? We will continue to hold on to these myths, right, about America being something that it's not. And if you continue to hold on to the myth, then you will be opposed to the radical and necessary and needed change that so many people are pressing for right now. And then you're part of the problem.